Thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm going to just sort of lay the ground really briefly and then turn it over to a conversation, which we started to have in the when you have the pre-conversation, you're like, there's the conversation. I hope this one is as good. So thank you all for coming together. Sarah Charlesworth, personally, for me, was an incredibly important figure who I was also lucky enough to meet when she was still alive and very much working. She was, and I think by all accounts, people would agree, one of the most generous thinkers and people. She was an incredibly respected teacher, and she left many, many students in her wake who've gone on to do amazing things. And to me, that's always a sign of an incredible artist, somebody who also thinks about the mentoring that happens along the way. And in fact, I was just coming from, sadly, the memorial for Slika Adoknap, who is another of these sort of figures who think about teaching as part of their practice, not just adjacent to it. So kind of interesting day. When I met Sarah, it was because I myself am a scholar, or was a scholar, in the kind of context of and the sort of opening up around feminist appropriation. So I was working on we'll talk about this today, the circle, oftentimes referred to as pictures. We might problematize that a little bit today, but particularly the women artists who were involved in rethinking what now has become, I think, a really vibrant and complicated conversation around what it means to share images, to take images, to steal images, to reuse images. And I think, Martine, it'll be really interesting to hear how you think about yourself either in that legacy or opposed to it or in discussion with it. Sarah was 1 foot in the pictures conversation and 1 foot out, which is something I also am curious to have Christine talk about today. She troubled even that narrative, which was meant to trouble art history, which is very interesting. And I think part of that has to do, and you can see with the amazing images around us, with her absolute, I would say, obsession with complicating the sort of tenets of criticism and tenets of pleasure, which continues, I think, to be a really important aspect of feminist practice. So these are images, like many of the other images that she worked on and thought about, that both kind of pulled the veil apart, look what culture does and what it puts on us and how it compels us to think that we want things. And then she also, I think, embraced those desires as actually fully appropriate and self-produced. There's a lot of agency in this work, as far as I'm concerned. There was in 1977 an incredibly pivotal show called Pictures, which was curated by the amazing art historian Douglas Crimp. And in that, he makes an argument that, and the wording is more or less, today we experience reality only through the pictures that we make of it. And I think what's great about Sarah is that mediating factor, which Douglas called distance, she also problematizes. I think in acknowledging the mediation of culture, she actually drew things closer in some way. And that's something that I again, hope we talk about today. Today, the three folks that are assembled here in various ways, we're going to talk about production. I'm going to start with Christine in a moment and ask you to kind of focus us as to where this series lands in Sarah's work. And then we're going to also talk about artistic responses, both I think historically and today, in terms of these two amazing folks who are sitting next to me. Martine just opened the most beautiful show, I have to say. I was just at the opening 2 nights ago. And I thought a lot about how this dialogue would go relative to that conversation. Before I hand it off to Christine, I would also just say it's so wonderful to have people in real time and space. So I hope we can also hear from you about your responses to this show. I wrote about Sarah's work in the 2015, I worked at the New Museum at the time, and I was lucky enough to write an essay on this work. And I spent a ton of time in her archives, which were made available to me. She was an incredible writer. She was a theoretician in her own right. And I would just say, in addition to thinking about her production of images, maybe today we can think about where language lives, where theory lives. This is an artist who was as much a conceptualist as a materialist, and bringing those two things together is really key. She started 2 really important magazines, The Fox and oh my God, I'm blanking out on
Bomb.
I just bombed on bomb and bomb. And thinking about how language played into her oeuvre, I think, is quite important too. So, Christine, I'm going to start off with you and have you sort of lay the ground for 2002. We are sitting in a room that is more or less, as we just heard, the first time that we've seen the complete series since it was first hung. I also learned really interestingly that in its first iteration, these were not hung in one, which I think is really interesting. They were not hung at one eye level midpoint, but that they were hung with different sort of heights and different spacing, and that there's the desire in this hanging to make them current, which I actually think is fantastic. But we're more or less sitting with the original works 20 years later. So I'll just hand it to you.
Thanks so much for having me. And so as Johanna was saying, this series was created in 2002, and it was shown in New York at Gorney, Bravin, and Lee. And just to kind of jump backwards a little bit, you were referencing her kind of conceptual art beginnings and her language and magazine-based beginnings. So I think it's interesting to contextualize this in that from 1977 to 1991, Charlesworth employed specific strategies of appropriation and maybe what we call rephotography. So she would, seek out images from magazines and newspapers and press images from the New York Public Library's picture collection. And she would arrange these images in either subtractive ways, where she would maybe remove text, or in additive ways, and re-photograph these new collages or photo montages. And she worked in this way for many years with many different kinds of series. But a shift happened, and this is to really truncate a very long and prolific practice. But in 1991, maybe this is kind of a turning point. She purchases a set of studio lights, and the idea at that point was to maybe, instead of photographing pictures, to create her own, to start photographing in the studio, to start photographing objects and sets that she created. And so she starts doing that. The first series she did that with was Natural Magic in 1992. And then I like to think, she works with that kind of modified toolbox of using a 4x5 rail camera and using film and working with these sets to this series a decade later, where she takes it maybe another small level further and starts incorporating digital technology like Photoshop. And so all of these things that she was trying to get at, I think, in her studio, new things opened up to her that she could modify images in different ways. Maybe even, all of these are touched in some way digitally. Sometimes it's just enhancing the color to something that she couldn't achieve otherwise. And in other images, such as tree over there, the green image, that's an image where the entire context is taken out and removed. So what's left is a tree. And we'll talk about this, but I think one direction we could go with this is she was thinking a lot about symbols and what does it mean to constitute a symbol? If you alienate an image or an object and isolate it from its context, does it stand in for that thing? Does it stand in for something? What does it represent? And there's a lot going on in the series, but maybe we could start there.
Yeah, that's terrific. I think one thing too that you're bringing up, something I also think about these as sort of theory jokes. Like the tree is actually a famous example of how one talks about the word tree and the picture tree and the thing tree, right? So she's actually, I think she's very funny too, and these are luscious and beautiful, but they're also tongue-in-cheek. The Magritte pipe is obviously super recognizable, but I think there are ways in which all of these kind of play on theoretical but also mass media tropes. Something that you brought up, though, that maybe we can come to Martine with is the idea of what is the subject of these works. And oftentimes, I go back to Sarah, I talk about her in the first person just because it feels nice to do so, but there were quotes in her archives, and they've kind of happened, they've circulated around, where she talks about the work as actually locating herself in the world, right? So in that idea of locating yourself in the world, suddenly there's a subject. And that subject, which again, I think through cliches of appropriation and 70s kind of pictures artists, it was about the sort of thinning of the subject becoming next to nothing. And I think her insistence on saying these pictures are locating me in front of an object, I'm locating myself in front of an object, is similar to arguments I've made about people like Sherry Levine, where this isn't actually an undoing of an image, it's the work is happening sometimes around the frame, it's not always in the visible. If you're reading the news, you know that this is a huge debate right now, where creativity, and again, where it lives. But Martine, when you're looking at this work and thinking about, for instance, your relationship to it, maybe you could talk a little bit about how when you're producing work, you think about the subject of the work, which to me continues to be a really interesting way to start conversations around image reuse.
Yeah, I mean, I think that often, I've talked about this a lot with a friend of mine, like Liv Barrett, who has Chateau, where we talk about when people ask, like, what is the work about?
Yeah.
And you're always like, well, it's not about one thing ever, really. And in some ways, people's practices, especially I think Sarah's in this show, it's about a way of like touching the world and like using images in that way. When you were talking about pictures, which I'll just use that for right now, as to collect a wide group of practices. But yeah, some people might use it as distance, but I think a lot of like appropriation or rephotography in my own work is like because there's actually like a real intimacy with an image, and there's something, whether it's like a symbol from a kind of personal iconography or mythology or more cultural representation of something, like you mentioned, the sort of one that references the Magritte painting, or that's this art historical symbol, you know, or the tree. In addition to the kind of philosophy, you could also think about that in terms of like a religious start that has this kind of feminist, whether it's like Eve or Lilith. And so I think that my interest in photography a lot of times, and with this work, is about how do you find those touch points of like this artist finding a way of making sense of kind of their world, but also in 2002, you have a wider range of tools of manipulation available, so then you can start to kind of change what the image is in a different way. And I feel like, you know, with somebody as far back as like Eisenstein talking about like a Kino eye, which means that with the advent of the technology, we start to like see the image when we're looking around. It just changes the way you look at the world, changes the way you look at a person. I mean, I just think about this with like amateur photography a lot, which is something I'm really interested in, like have collected for a long time. It's like there's certain ways that photos looked 30 years ago that they just don't look anymore. Like the production value has gotten so much higher because of the technology, but also because people have more of a sense of technique. Like I always use the example of backlighting. Like when you were taking a snapshot at a family party in the 80s, not everyone was conscious of being backlit, but like now everyone knows, like, oh no, wait, we should go over here because the light's like that. And so that just changes the way that the image looks through time. And so I think like with these, there is a kind of, maybe like, I don't want to say it's totally eradicated, but there's something sort of removed of those time stamps because of the way that she's sort of playing with like digital manipulation.
Yeah, I love that. When I came in to see this show, I hadn't seen these images in quite some time, and I mentioned sort of walking in, they almost look more contemporary than they did when I saw them the first time.
Yeah.
And to your point, she was, I think, anticipating something about where technology would go, even though it wasn't quite there yet, which is interesting. And I think about in your work, in Mungo, yours as well, you play with, you could be sort of erasing more and more, but you also choose to bring more back in as well, sort of markers of older images or older technologies. I think a lot about, you know, how you literally pull from different time frames. Mungo, your last show here actually I think had a lot to do with that too. the kind of rapid, almost subconscious way in which the images worked to complicate time. Do you want to talk a little bit about your own relationship to this work, or some of the questions that we're raising around technology and subjectivity?
It's funny to think about this body of work as the beginning of an arc that kind of moves through my generation and to Martine's, and specifically around technology and the way that what's possible in 2023 versus 2003. And I really liked what you said about the Kino eye and the way that we basically apply a lens to everything as we move through the world. For me, this artist and this generation of artists was super key because they were really prominent when I was beginning art school. And I happened to go to this program that was sort of conservative and this art program that was conservative and sort of abstract painting focused. And when I started learning about these artists, she talks about, in this interview that I read, searching for a common vocabulary in the work, and that was something that I was looking for too. I wasn't interested in like developing an obscure language that other people would have to decode. I wanted to just go straight to the town square and speak the language that everyone speaks, and that was sort of, and so at UC Santa Cruz where I was, I just started taking photo classes and history of consciousness classes, and that set me down this other path. But, and I ended up working really closely with the teacher of a lot of the pictures artists, John Baldessari, and he similarly said something about the importance of speaking the common tongue. Yeah. And that's always been super important to me. I don't know if that answers your question.
It totally does, and it actually makes me want to go back to Christine and ask this question, which is, again, the sort of, I'll do the quotes too. Pictures artists are often narrated as being sort of operating at the highest, most elite level of sort of theoretical discourse, but they're utilizing, to your point, a kind of populist, or they're enabling a populist lens that's in a kind of direct contradiction to that, and starts to move into, and I want to talk with both of you about this too, branding and actually the sort of larger market and the larger world of images. And that is something that was always a tension, I think, internal to the, maybe not internal to the work, but internal to the readings of the work that wanted it to be sort of live in critique only without moving into marketing culture. So maybe you can talk, Christine, a little bit about Sarah's own background and how she was interested in and troubled that distinction between, for lack of a better term, at that time people were talking about the high and the low, and were really reluctant to bring those things together. We were saying too in our conversation, I think everyone acts like everything's conflated now, but actually there are very clear lines, clear red lines that people get nervous about, and I think it's interesting to talk about that now. So I don't know if you want to just talk about the sort of vernacular around this work, and then Sarah's own thinking about it.
Well, it makes me think about, when she was starting out, how photography was such a kind of separate medium, and now everything's so integrated, and maybe we don't think about it so much, but 1977 pictures, at that same time, I mean, some of the shows at MoMA were like a William Eggleston color show or something, and that was very specific to photography, to photographers. And at that time, Charlesworth was, moving in kind of conceptual circles and moving into what we would now maybe contextualize as pictures. But, she didn't consider herself a photographer, but was very interested in using it to the ends that you're describing. But, as a kind of way to critique, hierarchies and patriarchal structures and different things like that. But at the same time, there is this other side where photography is, everyone's a photographer, and so it was a way to kind of connect or engage on a larger level and kind of institute some kind of connection. And I think that she also was aware of like a photographic lineage and legacy, and that she was, whether she considered herself a photographer or not, she was making photographs that were participating in a certain history. And so I think that a lot of her work throughout the years references, that history and art history too. But yeah, so I don't know, maybe that kind of dual-sided idea of critique but connection, and thinking about photography as being a really great vehicle for that.
Maybe the word is ambivalence. I think there's kind of one of the signature features of pictures art is this calling attention to the seductive nature and the suspect nature of images simultaneously, and that you should mistrust them, but they're also very alluring. And I think my generation is deeply ambivalent about everything that we're talking about.
You're
troubled. You can say troubled.
You're speaking for your generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak for all of us. Gen X.
But is the troubling part of the content of your work? I mean, when I look at...
Does it find its way in?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, sure. Yeah, the ambivalence is
in the work.
And sometimes it's just about context or economics or social factors external to the work that nonetheless shape it. But I'm like Sarah, I'm drawn to certain things and suspicious of them at the same time.
Yeah.
And I'm careful about the kinds of images and kind of content that I'm drawn to, and I'm always circling it a little warily.
Can you give an example of something that it makes you suspicious? I'm curious.
Well, anytime there's any kind of overt branding in the work,
Okay.
I'm a little nervous about it, and then I'm either nervous about getting into litigation, or on the other side of that, the brand likes what I'm doing,
Right.
and reaches out,
And that makes you really suspicious.
Oh, and that makes me nervous too. So it's sort of a double-edged sword.
What about you, Martine? How do you feel in that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely relate to that. I think it's sort of hard because everything gets eaten immediately, so it's sort of difficult sometimes to find, I don't know, sometimes I feel like it's like a losing game for me to find my way out of that, to make something that can't be ripped off, basically. Right. But I was thinking when you were first talking about it, my entry to sort of art, I was really interested. I grew up in Pasadena, whatever, so I knew a lot about Impressionism because of Norton Simon, but I went to PCC, and I remember in printmaking being introduced to Richard Prince and really being like, oh yeah, I fuck with this, I get it. It instantly connected with me, and something I was kind of already naturally doing, the type of images I was liking to make, what I was recreating, and I think also because I was sort of in this bridge between, more digital and analog and digital, so it was I think coming about in that, but also then I went to art school and I had to work, and it seemed like photography is very functional in that capacity. So I worked for photographers that were artists, in Chicago I worked for Barbara Castanen for a long time, who's maybe an interesting person in terms of this
Really interesting,
mode of between digital or doing work that was sort of collaging. But then I also worked for fashion photographers. And I think that, I don't know, for me, it kind of became this weird day and night thing. That was I could not tell what was the day and what was the night sometimes. Because there were jobs that I had where having a very deep knowledge of art history came in really handy, because it was basically we're gonna rip that off, but then at the same time, because I was a lot of the artists that I was really interested in, especially I would say when I was in college, I was really interested in like Seth Price or something, in you, Mungo. So I was like, oh, it's fine, right? You make a lot, you take a lot, like that's what we're doing. And I think it got more complicated the older I got, but also my own artwork sort of being in the world. Yeah. And you're like, hey, wait, I did that.
I think the speed is really key that you mentioned, that it's so fast now. Who has time to quibble over whether an artist is selling out or something? It just seems like such an antiquated conversation to have, especially when, it's just like, it's happening as quickly as this.
And people are putting their work on that too, which is like, I don't know. Then
and
what?
Doing good business.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And you got to keep the lights on. So
I don't know, but I'm always very interested in like the functional part of images, just meaning like that you can show somebody, you can use it as notes, you can like show something, but also that there's like this, how am I trying to say this, like that's something I like. Like I spoke with Ansel Bergen, the poet, and he talked about language. Like he said, sometimes it's hard to write a poem because people know what words mean. So if you want the word to mean something different, it's like there's always going to be this gap. And I sometimes think about that in making images. Like you were talking about brands. I definitely use brands. If you go to the show, there's a lot of brands in there. There's a lot of just like my daily detritus. But it's like, how can I make it, kind of will bother me if somebody's like, oh, so this is about consumerism. I'm like, oh, fuck. No. But like, how can I make it not be recognized in that way, which is maybe an interesting challenge to me.
I wonder also from something you said, here we're in a room of analog generated images, which are just starting to touch on Photoshop, as you said, and my work is really, really concerned with the line between analog and digital, and you're much more of a digital artist, it seems to me, or certainly that's your native technology, you might say. Whereas I was like born in an analog world and had to adapt to a digital one, and whereas she was pretty much an analog artist, and I think that's part of it too. I think I sort of don't trust digital images in a weird way. Like they came late in my life, or they came in my 20s, and now they're everywhere, and I use them myself. And I shoot all my work digitally, but I shoot analog material digitally. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing, back to suspicion of images, I guess, where I don't quite believe in digital space in this weird way. Like the internet doesn't feel real, even though
this question of functionality that you're both kind of pointing to, and it's something I've thought a lot about, Martine, too, is that, and especially in the art world, it's when you walk into a museum, you understand you're looking at art, right? And if your work sort of migrates outside of that in some way, it also calls into question that envelope, which is actually really important in terms of this work. But I think in terms of museums are super, I'm saying this from, I love museums, I run a museum, but these are outmoded structures, right? And so we're having in real time to kind of think about how to make them relevant in a way. And so I think back to pictures artists where there were mechanisms for that. Like Troy Brontak, you looked at the image before you saw the title. And then when you saw the title, suddenly you were like, whoa, oh, now I know what that image is. And when I look at it without a title, I look at it in one way. And then when I understand the context, suddenly that happens. And I think the speed that you're both talking about is so interesting because people assume there's a different kind of literacy, but also a kind of abstraction. I mean, George Baker Wright, we're thinking about, who has talked in many scenarios about this sort of abstraction of neoliberal capitalism. All images do sort of move at this pace and they flatten out, but there's also the possibility of pulling them out and utilizing them differently. So I wonder, I mean, what would Sarah be making if she were alive today, do you think?
I don't know that I can answer that, but
It's something I thought about,
Yeah.
well,
thinking about us
I
together.
could, well, maybe before I answer that, I was thinking when you both were talking that, you know, this kind of idea of being suspicious of images. You know, in her notes on this project, she talked about how every photograph in this series inhabits a kind of truth and a fiction. So it's, you know, whether it's because of the digital, you know, interference or technology, or even in playing with scale, you know, like the table, for instance, right? By confusing the scale of things, that also kind of messes with what's real or what, you know, what is a photograph or what is a real object. But I think, you know, when you're talking about that suspicion, I think that really is a big part of this series too. You know, it's just thinking about, you know, how do we figure out, you know, what is real or what do we believe? You know, it seems maybe commonplace now, but one of her ideas she was thinking about is like, even back in 2002, of thinking about a photograph as having a kind of truthiness, you know, like an authority, and we know that's not possible now, but she was playing with that idea a lot, I think.
Maybe you can both talk about what you think she
Yes.
would make, but I also wanted to say that in both of your works, you were saying what doesn't get eaten right away, or maybe if you use a homeopathic model, maybe it's okay, like the thing comes and pulls your mode of operating into it and doesn't understand that actually does something interesting. But I recently, we were lucky to screen a film of Martine's at MOCA, and I was thinking about just the narrative form and the way in which sometimes I really love this film because it's an extension of, I think, things that you've done, but it also takes its time. It literally takes its time. It's a single day, right?
Yeah.
And it's a single day that takes an hour and a half. And it's beautiful and it's funny, but it also, you can't quite have it, if that makes sense, you know? And Mungo too, you work in time-based medium. So maybe you can both talk about narrative or time in relationship to these kinds of practices too. I was going to say that Sarah maybe would be making films. You know, I don't know.
I wonder.
Would be interesting.
Or, you know, she would be making things today that incorporated elements of work she was making when these were made.
Right,
You know, this kind
absolutely.
of self-referencing.
Yeah.
You could also imagine her using AI or AR or 3D technology and sort of continually updating the practice technologically to make these same sorts of images as some other people embedded in photographic practice do. But it's something I thought about before the talk, and how if she were alive, she might be doing work like ours, time-based work, and because I think we do both make work that interrogates mass cultural imagery and mass culture in general, and puts images through a kind of through the ringer, you might say, and messes it up. So, yeah.
I was also thinking about what you're saying about like the fact and sort of fiction in both of these, because I think there's like, there was a show I had maybe 2016 at ICA London that I called Fact in Trouble, which was after this phrase that Margot Jefferson had included in her memoir, which was just basically about like the way she was orienting telling her story, and that like she would try to be as honest as possible, but that obviously there was going to be this sort of like reconstruction happening, and she called it kind of Fact in Trouble. And I also like Kevin Young, like the poet, the way he talks about like this idea of truth, like he spells like TROOF, and that sometimes that's like the truest thing. And I feel like the thing is, like, images have always sort of been false or whatever, you know. I think about those fairy images, I forget what they're called now, but the ones that are like I want to say they're like 1800s, like British, where the little girls saw, like, they said they saw fairies, and they sort of set them up. But then, you know, you could think of something like, I'm thinking like Frank Vander Zee's studio, which was like a photo studio where people would kind of like, when they migrated from the South and they came to New York, they would like take these photos to show their family, send back to their family and be like, we're doing really good. But like actually they weren't living in great conditions, it wasn't this thing, but they made sure in that photo to like dress up, make sure they looked great, to sort of show this idea of the city. And so I feel like that's always part of the medium to a degree that I like. I think maybe the narrative is not so literary for me often, and maybe that's what you were talking about in the film, is like sometimes you can't, you're like, oh, I didn't get it, like where was the final moment? And I sort of like, I don't know, I guess like setting things up and then like building the image up and then kind of, putting it through the ringer or taking it away from you, like what's so seductive about it or satisfying.
Yeah, well, and what you're saying that's great too is this idea, I mean, to Christine's point, this idea that I think people still want to believe photographs are documents of the truth, and I think part of the pain these days is this realization that they're really truly not, but in fact it has so much to do with your own experience of something and what the document is are often completely different. If you see a picture of something and you're like, but I was there, and
that's kind of what I love though. Like for some reason it's popping in my head is this like internet folklore about Avril Lavigne. That years ago there's like a rumor that she
replaced by double.
That she was like replaced. And like we don't know because like we haven't seen her in like a real image. But I've always loved stuff like that, Weekly World News kind of like in the grocery store. Like that's the kind of, I'm always just naturally drawn to that stuff. And I think maybe thinking also that Sarah worked on Bomb and had these other kind of practices. Like I love, I don't know, something about conspiracy or circulating. I love like recently on TikTok there was a thing with the AI, because on Britney Spears, like she covered her face, she puts her hand over her face and like it like glitches, and people are kind of saying a similar thing, but it's really just that she's using like a beauty filter. But I like that.
She's a robot.
She's an alien. That's what I
mean, in a way, I wonder if that generalized suspicion of mass cultural imagery signals the success of the pictures project. You know, that they planted the seed and it flowered.
Did people, and we'll take questions in a second, did people read the piece yesterday in the Times that said like AI is basically going to be the next pandemic, and 350 of the top like people who are building AI were like, this is literally going to destroy the world. Like just it's a one sentence like warning to the world. So I guess in that logic,
but we're not slowing down.
But the reason I bring it up is because I think there's this idea that we control these things. That's really interesting, and I think both of you, but also this work, sort of said, no. There's this is a full cycle. This isn't about like you're creating a thing that you can control. That thing becomes its own space that then comes back and enforces who we are. And it's an interesting. I'm sounding doom and gloomy, but I think there's a positive to this too, which Martine's pointing to, which is you can also imagine other futures and you can start creating other narratives. So, but it was a really scary article in the Times if people read it. I was like, I don't even understand how it works, but they were like on par with the pandemic and nuclear war. Like, but I don't know if anyone else understands. Like, I was like, but how?
Well, it's
what
so
does that
different
actually
too
mean?
than how the social media executives acted when they were called before Congress. They're like, we'll self-regulate, we're good. And these guys are like, please regulate us.
Please regulate us. They're saying, please regulate us. Yeah. Is this a good place to open up, do you think? Okay. I also just want to say, I could talk to all of you all day about this work, but it's just astounding how beautiful it is and
it's gorgeous.
How relevant, and I don't know, it feels really great to sit in the room, so thank you. Do people have questions for these amazing folks?
Why would you draw the lines
iconography. Right here.
That's right,
in
yeah.
the room.
I mean, it really does seem to be an exploration of the universal symbol. I have sort of a biographical question about it, actually, Christine. This is sort of mid-career Sarah Charlesworth, right? She's like early 50s.
Yeah, I think her daughter kind of said technically like the very center of her career was about 10 years before this. But yes, like when she started making the images in her studio. But yeah, this is roughly mid-career. Yeah.
Mungo, you're saying it would have been also mid-career.
Oh.
Right.
Oh.
And it feels that way to me.
It does,
in
yeah.
the sense of its interiority relative to the earlier work,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
also outing myself as a mid-career artist. It just has this like. There comes a time when the studio becomes more interesting than the world, and you just want to be in there, and everything else is a little distracting and annoying, and also maybe you have little kids running around like she did, and so I don't know. I relate to it personally.
How so, Mungo? In that way? Like
Just
you're
in that
turning
way of
in?
like I kind of just I only want to be in the studio now.
Yeah.
You know, and you begin to feel the shrinkage of time, and you
Yeah.
want to get more done, and
Yeah.
and you want to go down your rabbit hole, you
Yeah.
know, and have less distraction, which is increasingly difficult. And but that's sort of what I see in this work.
That brings up for me too how, and this was something I thought of when I saw your show, Martine, of throughout her career she would, go back to previous projects and bring in, certain themes or certain objects. And I was thinking about that with your work, your use of boxes and bags and stickers. And I was wanting to ask you a little bit about that too, because I think for Charlesworth it was so important, that she, before made another photograph of a lotus bowl and referenced Eve Klein times before and made another moon photograph. And these things like kept coming back. And anyway, I don't know, Martine, if you want to talk about that with your work, because I really liked seeing those things repeat.
Yeah, I'm like, what would I say? I'm still thinking about all that work, I guess.
Sure.
But there is really like, I definitely have always had where I'll get like an image stuck in my head, and maybe that's part of like what your question about photography and iconography is like. There'll be, maybe I'll see something, or like a poster I had on my wall. Like I always save all these little pieces of paper and ephemera and things like that, and usually I have them sort of as this collage that's on like one of my doors, on a wall, on the fridge. So it's like these images that I'm walking by all the time, and they are very like oriented to my life in that moment. So it's like I really can pinpoint even kind of what you're saying when you're looking at the images and you're thinking about how somebody might want to be in their space in a different way and thinking through ideas. I think that's part of where that repetition comes from.
Thank you all for your comments. I was really taken by what you were saying, Martine, about the aboutness of the work, like touching the world. I think that really opened up everything for me. And as an artist, I also relate to that question being asked. And then it got me thinking about, how touch is an action of displacement somewhat, like of creating a new space that is away from your center and going somewhere else, as opposed to like obviously like more violently actually hitting, which is about pushing off. And that got me to think about the centrality in resonate with, what is centrality doing here? And I noticing that the objects are always centered within the frame. Yeah, like just if we could open up that terminology, periphery, centrality, I'd be interested to hear.
And Christine, maybe you can say, I think this is a nice question, and probably everyone can answer. Something that I meant to bring up, and your question prompts, is after this, at least as she narrates it, she starts to think less about the object and more about the light that touches the object in the studio. Like this idea that I care about the glass, but what I care about more is how the light interacts with that glass. And I think that's such a beautiful, it's a metaphor too, right? I think for things, but I don't know if you could say more about that, but that was a particular shift, I think, towards what Mungo's also talking about. Like there's a tenderness to that too, as well as a criticality, like acknowledging that it's more than the thing.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of her final project, which was made in 2012, and it was called Available Light, and she made these photographs in a kind of newish studio that she had, and she, this idea of getting lost in your studio, she started to look at the light in her studio and think about how to kind of play with that. And so she would layer the windows, layer the glass with different types of paper and create different colors that were coming through, or diffusing the light in different ways, sometimes in strips or in different designs. And we talked a little bit in the beginning about this idea of pleasure, and it's something that I think about a lot with some of the women artists that were making work beginning when Charlesworth did. And I think Available Light is such a nice example of it, because I think that it showed, these images of her studio, photographs she'd made before that were kind of placed into the studio, so it was referencing these other projects, but also, she was really engaged with all the processes and particulars of making a photograph, and kind of, it was almost about the material means and kind of getting lost in that, right? And finding pleasure in that, and yeah.
Mungo, do you make anything pleasurable?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's very pleasurable for me, making work.
It's pleasurable to watch too, just as a...
Oh, that's good.
Good.
Okay. Yeah, I generally, it's, I don't know if you can control these forces, but I think in the end, it's pleasure, cathecting to something. But I'm interested in this idea of centrality too, because the project of Sarah's that I love so much is the Modern History project, which is so much about the placement of the image and competing with blank space. And then with the stills, the figure is in motion, and it's wherever the photographer happened to capture them. And so you have the work sort of sliding towards the center over these bodies of work. I was lucky enough to meet Sarah also when she was doing shows with Margot Levin, 20 years ago, which was the gallery I worked with as well here. And she was showing those, sort of like watercolor and makeup arrangements, like shot
like
on
paint
a copy
pigments
stand. Yeah,
and,
paint pigments. What's the name of that project?
It's escaping me right
Okay.
now.
Those also have a kind of diffused. Those are less central than these, but still matching frames, and the consideration of the object overall. I think we haven't talked about that, but it seems so much to be a part of her saying, "I'm not just a photographer. I'm an artist. These are objects. These are really lush, desirable things that can kind of exceed photographic space, and especially with these works, sort of live in a kind of platonic, symbolic space. And but yeah, I mean, just the process of matching the yellow lamp to the frame exactly, or the red candle to the frame exactly, to the print exactly, I should say, is all, it's very considered as a total production.
I'll say one more thing about centrality. You know, there was this series she made between 83 and 89 called Objects of Desire, and they really resemble the series, but at that time she was cutting out really bold colored magazine images and affixing them to monochrome backgrounds with matching frames. And I think it was a kind of compositional choice, and also just kind of like a way to, I don't know, it's centering the image, but the monochrome background became such an important part of it too. You know, she would have these different iterations of of Objects of Desire, and the backgrounds would represent different kinds of themes. Like the blue images represented metaphysical desire. You know, the red images represented, you know, sexuality and desire, and so it almost became that the image was, you know, so connected to the background color and what that color represented. So I don't know. This series really resembles that formally, but and has some overlaps conceptually too, I think.
We have time for one more.
Yeah, you brought up something that I've been thinking, and it kind of ties into your question as well, just the importance of the object itself, and what you think, you know, now photography, like you pick up your phone and say, no, just, you know, we're eating it really quickly. And is that a place for museums to assert themselves? Like, you need the object, guys, you can't just, you know, eat this on your phone. And these are so beautifully framed that they call to themselves as objects. And how important do you think that is, not just in this work here, but going forward with your work?
I mean, it's very important to my work. Like, I feel like I'm thinking a lot about both of those spaces, like I, you know, whatever, AFK, the away from keyboard, but also like how you'll see it online, and like sometimes the collapse of that. Like a few years ago, I was doing a lot more stuff with like AR and thinking about, but what the kind of sculptural or installation is, I think is a really different experience. But I also understand a lot of people are gonna like see it on the internet as well. So it's not like I'm maybe a purist. I'm not that precious about it in terms of a thing I can't control. I feel like that's maybe where I've come to with it. It's like, it used to really bother me. I felt like, oh, I wish I had been like Margiela or something, where I never like agreed to be photographed, or like Bruce Hanley, how he cuts himself out all the talks. I was like, that's really cool. I wish I had done that, but it's kind of too late in a certain regard. Maybe I'll still disappear, but I feel like I just kind of like let it exist. I don't try to control that side of it, but I know that that's a way people are going to be seeing it. So like with the AR project, was for a show I had in MoMA, and it really occurred to me when I was doing, I tried to do a lot of site visits because I was like in New York, so I was just going by a lot and seeing how people would be in the space. And everybody was on their phone. Like meaning everyone was sort of mediating the work through their phone.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, I should do something that sort of like uses this behavior that's already happening, because I was really interested in, I guess, how in installations, or the way I think about a show is like how somebody's moving through it, and what I don't know, there's just these conventions, ways that we view art that I think about. And I remember one of the techs who was helping me with somebody, when I was like showing them how it would work, he was like, oh, it's just gonna put everyone on their phone. And I'm like, everyone's already on it.
Yeah.
It's not like, yeah, ship has sailed. So I might as well be thinking about that space. I don't know, that's kind of how I come to it, but I do think of two different ways if you've never seen my work installed and you've only seen it on the screen.
For me, it's the step sibling, the digital part. I really try to like the show in here was very somatic. It was very immersive, and you felt it in your body, and that was really important that you be here. That it be analog in that sense, that you have a physical encounter with a real thing in real space. But likewise, I also totally accept that the other thing is dominant, and so I sort of make allowances for it, or try to, game it out somehow. But sometimes and I've been really surprised by the life some of my work has had online. But it's, like I said, it's just sort of innate in me that I don't quite believe it or trust it or something. But I see it happening, so I just live in liminal space, in that discomfort, exactly. Ambivalent.
Yeah.
It's funny though, I mean, your question reminds me, when Robert Smithson made Spiral Jetty, it was like, is Spiral Jetty the land art, or is it the film, or is it the writing? And he was like, yes, right?
Yeah.
And it's all the work. I feel like something that both of your work does is pull back this idea of the original being one or the other. It's, you've sort of used the kind of original material of digital online, you've pulled it back into the material, and you've done that too, Mungo. So somehow troubling this idea that one is lesser, or they're just part of the work, and that's kind of an interesting thing that happens here too. Back to the first question, like, these are icons, and they're objects, and they're symbols, and they're all the things, which is amazing.
And they're also these constructed things.
And they're constructed, they're everything. See, so we can end on a positive note. They're everything.
They're everything.
Everything, everywhere, all at once. They're bagels. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.